Let me first start off by thanking the leadership of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Corker, its chairman, and Ranking Member Cardin, for creating the environment to have strong bipartisan legislation on a critical issue that affects the national interest and security of the United States. And beyond that, in general, creating a strong bipartisan environment that I think is critical to U.S. foreign policy. It's a tone I try to set when I had the privilege of being the chairman, and Senator Corker was then the ranking member. And I appreciate his leadership in continuing in the same spirit, and of course, Senator Cardin, who works very hard on maintaining that environment. So I appreciate that they created the wherewithal to bring us here today. I want to thank Senator Gardner as the Asia Subcommittee chairman for working with me to bring legislation that we can come together in a strong bipartisan voice, because when the nation speaks with one voice, it speaks most powerfully to both friends and foes across the world. And it's been a privilege to work with Senator Gardner and see his vision of how we dealt with this and merge my vision with how we dealt with it. And together we've come with, I think, the most comprehensive strategic effort to deal with North Korea. So I want to salute him and I want to thank him for working with me. Mr. President, giving the North Korean regime's recent test of what most agree is a ballistic missile, what UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon characterized as deeply deplorable and in violation of Security Council resolutions, one thing is abundantly clear when you look at this photograph. It's time to take North Korea seriously. Seriously. Now, for too many years, the standard response of Republican and Democratic administrations alike, whenever North Korea stages a provocation, has been to dismiss the seriousness of the threat. We tend to see it as a strange regime, seemingly disconnected from geopolitical reality, something of a parallel universe that doesn't function in the same way as the rest of the international community. A strange regime run by crazy leaders and certain to collapse any day, that there's no need to worry, it won't and it can't survive. Well, 4 nuclear tests, 3 Kims, 2 violations of UN Security Council resolutions, and 1 attempt by North Korea to transfer nuclear technology to Syria later. It's clearly time for the United States to start taking the North Korea challenge seriously. In fact, today, it is estimated that North Korea has accumulated enough fissile material for more than a dozen nuclear weapons. It has now conducted 4 nuclear explosive tests, as you can see from this chart, starting in October of 2006, and with it, the quake magnitude rising with virtually every test. It has developed a modern gas centrifuge uranium enrichment program to go along with its plutonium stockpile. It has tested ballistic missiles, and it is seeking to develop the capability to match a nuclear warhead to an intercontinental ballistic missile. Kim Jong-un has consolidated his grip on power, and he seems determined to proceed on a course of Beijing, Kim Jong-un's policy that strengthens both his military and his economy, as opposed to strengthening one or the other. Taken together, these developments present a growing danger that could set North Korea on a path to becoming a small nuclear power, a scenario which could also lead other nations in the region to reconsider their own commitments to non-proliferation. And it could embolden North Korea in its relations with other bad actors like Syria and Iran. Now, I know it has been referenced, but I think it's worthy that when the Director of National Intelligence, the person in charge of amassing all of our intelligence as a country, James Clapper, in testimony before the Armed Services Committee says the following, it's worth repeating: North Korea's export of ballistic missiles and associated materials to several countries, including Iran and Syria, and its assistance to Syria's construction of a nuclear reactor destroyed in 2007, illustrates its willingness to proliferate dangerous technologies. Director Clapper went on to say that following North Korea's third nuclear test, Pyongyang said it would refurbish and restart its nuclear facilities to include the uranium enrichment facility at Yongbyon, shut down in 2007, and that it has followed through by expanding its Yongbyon enrichment facility and restarting the plutonium production reactor, which has been online long enough to begin recovering plutonium from spent fuels within weeks or maybe months. He told the committee, and I quote, "Pyongyang is also committed to developing a long-range nuclear-armed missile that is capable of posing a direct threat to the United States. It has publicly displayed its KN-08 road mobile ICBM on multiple occasions. We assess," this is the Director of National Intelligence saying, "we assess that North Korea has already taken initial steps towards fielding this system," close quote. Finally, Mr. President, according to the Director of National Intelligence, and I quote again, "North Korea probably remains capable and willing to launch disruptive or destructive cyber attacks to support its political objectives." Now, though it hasn't received the attention it deserved during today's debate, the Gardner-Menendez substitute addresses the cybersecurity threat with robust sanctions against those who control North Korea's cyber warfare apparatus. So, Mr. President, the adoption of the Gardner-Menendez legislation creates a new policy framework that combines effective sanctions and effective military countermeasures that can stop North Korea's nuclear ambitions, address cybersecurity issues, and bring some sanity back to the political calculus. A new policy framework that leaves no doubt about our determination to neutralize any threat North Korea may present with robust, realistic diplomacy towards the clear goal of a denuclearized Korean peninsula. This bipartisan bill, approved unanimously by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in January, expands and tightens enforcement of sanctions for North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile development and other destructive activities of the Kim regime. It requires the president to investigate sanctionable conduct, including proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, arms-related materials, luxury goods, human rights abuses, activities undermining cybersecurity, and the provision of industrial materials like precious metals or coal for use in a tailored set of activities, including weapons of mass destruction, proliferation activities, or for use in prison and labor camps. Under our substitute, the president is mandated to sanction any person found to have materially contributed to or engaged in or facilitated any of those above activities. Penalties would include the seizure of assets, visa bans, and denial of government contracts. And to provide some flexibility, we have ensured that this and future administrations retain the discretionary authority to sanction any entity or person transferring or facilitating the transfer of financial assets and the property of the North Korean regime. The bill also requires the Secretary of the Treasury to determine whether North Korea is a primary money laundering concern. And if such a determination is made, assets may be blocked and special measures applied against those involved. So from a strategic perspective, the bill would promote a strategy to improve implementation and enforcement of multilateral sanctions, a strategy to combat North Korean cyber activities, and a strategy to promote and encourage international engagement on North Korean human rights-related issues. There are reporting requirements related to these strategies, as well as to report on political prison camps, and a feasibility study on providing communications equipment to the people of North Korea so we can permeate the opportunity for information to flow to the people of North Korea. And last but not least, under the Gardner-Menendez substitute, the State Department is required to expand the scope and frequency of travel warnings for North Korea. Now, that's what we think about most of the time when we think about North Korea. But there is a whole nother dimension beyond nuclear challenges, missile challenges, the proliferations of weapons of mass destruction, and that is the concerns that remain serious, unanswered questions about human rights and the lot of the North Korean people. We need only read the headlines like the one on this chart. Life in a North Korean labor camp, no thinking, just fear. Kim's former bodyguard tells of beatings, starvation in North Korean prison camp. North Korean prison camp is one of the most evil places on earth, home to 20,000 people. Under the rule of Kim Jong-un, North Korea is one of the most harshly repressive countries in the world. All basic freedoms have been severely restricted under the Kim family's political dynasty. A 2014 UN Commission of Inquiry found that abuses in North Korea were without parallel in any other country. Extermination, murder, enslavement, torture, imprisonment, rape, forced abortions, and unspeakable sexual violence are part of the ongoing story of this bizarre regime. We know that North Korea operates a series of secretive prison camps where opponents of the government are sent, tortured, abused, starved on insufficient rations, and forced into hard labor. Collective punishment is used to silence dissent and instill fear in the North Korean people that they could be next. The country has no independent media, it has no functioning civil society, and there is, of course, not even a hint of religious freedom, except for the bizarre worship of the line from which Kim Jong-un hails. That is the reality, making it abundantly clear that those security concerns may be our most important priority on the peninsula. They are not and should not be our only priority. The legislation we are proposing creates, for the first time, the basis in law to designate and sanction North Korea for its human rights violations. Such sanctions would elevate human rights and the fundamental issue of human dignity to be as important as nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. At the end of the day, there is no basis for successfully dealing with the North absent a solid foundation for a policy that is rooted in the U.S.-South Korea alliance. In President Park, we have an important partner. I have visited South Korea and met with President Park, someone we can easily consult with and work closely with to chart out a future course in dealing with North Korea. And our partnership with Japan presents new opportunities for building a more effective approach to dealing with Pyongyang. Whatever one's views on the various U.S. policy efforts of the past 2 decades, what has worked, what has not worked, and why, there can be little question that these efforts have failed to end North Korea's nuclear ambitions or end its missile programs. They have failed to reduce the threat posed by North Korea to our allies, failed to alleviate the suffering of North Korea's people, and failed to lead to greater security in the region. Now, let me be clear. I have no illusions that there are easy answers when it comes to dealing with a regime like North Korea. But with the passage of this legislation, we have acted in concert, not only in a bipartisan effort, but with our values. We will have established a policy for dealing with an unpredictable rogue regime equal to the challenge. And I urge of this body a unanimous vote. Because it's not enough to condemn North Korea's latest provocation, which is, by all accounts, a violation of UN Security Council resolutions and international will. It is not enough to convene the United Nations Security Council for another round of hollow rhetoric that does nothing to the Kim regime, but signal a lack of international commitment to enforcing international will. It is not enough to do what we have always done and minimize the obvious threat from a rogue state living in its own false reality. As the co-author of sanctions that brought Iran to the negotiating table, I know that the sanctions regime we are structuring here can have a real effect. Those who want to deal with North Korea and North Korea's pursuit of missile technology and nuclear weapons will see a consequence to them far beyond North Korea. With this bipartisan legislation, we have before us a series of meaningful steps that speak the only language North Korea's regime can understand: aggressive material consequences for aggressive, reckless provocations. This legislation is the most comprehensive strategy to deal with the challenge that North Korea presents. The launch over the weekend and recent nuclear tests makes it clear that when I introduced this bill last year, it was timely then. We didn't get to act on it then, but we can do so now. I urge the Senate, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to unanimously pass the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enforcement Act. I urge our colleagues in the other chamber to concur, and I look forward to the President quickly signing this legislation into law. And if the international community is serious about meeting the threat that North Korea poses, we should see measures like this act adopted by the United Nations and implemented by all its member states. The international community should stand together with a single voice and one clear message: any provocation will be met with consequences that will shake the Kim regimes to its foundations. That's the opportunity we have to set the course here today in the Senate. That's, I think, one of the most powerful moments when the Senate acts in a strong, bipartisan fashion that sends a message that will create a ripple effect, not only here, but across the world. And so I look forward to what I hope will be an incredibly robust, if not unanimous, vote on this legislation.